On January 29, 2000, Mike Tyson walked into the Manchester Evening News arena for a fight that had nothing to do with the heavyweight title and everything to do with proving he still had one. He had not fought on English soil before. Getting him there at all had been its own achievement for promoter Frank Warren, since a fighter with Tyson's criminal record needed special clearance simply to enter the country. The undercard, the ticket prices, the entire promotional machine built around this night existed for one reason.
The odds were heavily stacked towards Marsh being the guilty party. However, there was the ammunition
to find out whether the version of Tyson who terrified the sport in the 1980s could still be summoned on command, in front of an audience that had only ever seen him on tape. Julius Francis stood across from him as the reigning British and Commonwealth heavyweight champion, a domestic title holder, asked to absorb an international spectacle. Nobody serious thought Francis would win. He was a solid professional at home, competent against the level of opponent the British circuit produced, and almost nobody in that circuit had ever traded punches with a fighter of Tyson's speed. Warren had built his case for bringing Tyson to England on spectacle rather than competitiveness, and Francis was the domestic name willing to supply the other half of the equation, a champion in his own right, being fed to a bigger name for the sake of the occasion. Francis understood his own odds well enough to turn them into a punchline before a punch was thrown.
So why was he chief suspect? World of former Marine, fireman and IBF world champion, was previously promoted.
It was a joke that told the truth about how the fight was being read inside his own camp. Francis was not walking in believing he would leave undefeated. He was walking in because the payday, the platform, and the chance to share a card with the most recognizable heavyweight alive were worth more to his career than a loss on the record would cost him. This fight arrived at a specific point in Tyson's career, not a random one. He was still working to rebuild a reputation that had absorbed a prison sentence and, more recently, the disqualification against Holyfield for biting his opponent's ear, an incident that had made him as much a subject of public fascination as a boxer. A clean, dominant win on foreign soil was worth more to that rebuilding project than the level of opposition might suggest, because the goal was not to prove he could outbox a live contender. The goal was to show a global audience that the violence was still real and still on command. What nobody could joke away was the actual risk in the ring. Tyson, whatever had eroded in the years since his imprisonment and the disqualification loss to Evander Holyfield, still carried hand speed that a domestic-level heavyweight had no real answer for. Francis had faced hard punchers before. He had not faced anyone who could close distance and land a finished combination before an opponent's brain finished registering that the exchange had even started.
Some of these body shots.
That gap showed almost immediately. Tyson worked forward from the opening bell, and Francis's guard, adequate against slower operators, offered no real protection against punches he could not track in time to block. Tyson dropped him before the first round was over with a short punch that carried the kind of compact force that made him dangerous, specifically because his shots looked ordinary, right up until the instant they landed.
The attack is kind of a thing of beauty. It goes over. Covered by Tyson.
Francis climbed back up. He tried to reset his feet and reestablish distance. Before that same round ended, Tyson put him down a second time. What the two knockdowns in that first round actually revealed, watched closely, was less about Francis's chin than about the specific geometry Tyson had built his entire career around solving.
Nice hook, drove. Sucking air, looking for that second win now.
Francis was not being hit by punches he could not see because his eyes were slow. He was being hit because Tyson had already closed the distance to a range where the guard Francis had trained his whole career to trust no longer had time to do its job.
So there will be no knockout by young Mike Tyson.
A range most heavyweights never have to defend against because most heavyweights never generate the closing speed to force it. That distinction between a fighter with a flawed guard and a fighter facing a problem his guard was never built to solve is easy to blur in the moment, but it matters for understanding exactly what happened in that opening round. There is a specific kind of courage in returning to your feet against a fighter who has already shown you he can repeat the knockdown whenever he chooses, and Francis showed it twice. What he did not have was any credible way to change the terms of the fight. Tyson had solved him in the geometry of the opening minute. Get inside the jab, stay too close for Francis to generate real leverage on his own punches, and finish combinations before Francis's feet were set to answer back.
Scored his knockdown in the first round. That by itself wouldn't win the round for him. Second round.
The second round opened with the same problem restated, only faster. Tyson dropped Francis a third time, and then a fourth, each knockdown less about accumulated damage than about a fighter who had never faced anything resembling this trying and failing in real time to find an answer that did not exist.
Scoring. Counts for no more.
Referee Roy Francis stopped the contest 1-3 into round 2. There was no ambiguity in the decision. Julius Francis was upright, but had absorbed 4 knockdowns against a fighter showing no sign of running out of ways to produce a fifth. Stopping it was not a formality. It was the only responsible call available to a man watching a domestic champion get systematically dismantled in front of his own countrymen. Francis had not arrived at his own title by accident. Building a career at domestic level in Britain in the 1990s meant working through the same limited pool of opponents repeatedly, fighting for regional and national belts that carried real weight at home and almost none abroad. That path produces solid, durable professionals rather than fighters conditioned to face someone with Tyson's hand speed and finishing instinct. It is worth stating plainly, rather than glossing over, the gap on display in Manchester was not a failure of nerve or preparation on Francis's part. It was the structural gap between 2 different tiers of the sport meeting in the same ring, and no amount of preparation closes that kind of gap in 6 weeks of camp. The Manchester crowd reacted the way crowds do when the spectacle they paid for delivers exactly what the marketing promised, a strange satisfaction that has almost nothing to do with the loss their own countrymen just absorbed. Nobody had come expecting Francis to win. They had come to see whether Tyson, in the flesh, in their city, still looked like the fighter from the highlight reels. For 2 rounds he did, and the arena treated that confirmation as the actual product it had paid to receive. What made this fight matter, beyond its brevity, was what it confirmed about Tyson's continued commercial weight outside the United States. A card built entirely around one man's reputation had sold out an arena for what turned into a 2-round mismatch in a country where he had never previously fought.
Leaping left hook.
Yeah, you sure did.
That is not a small thing for a fighter several years removed from his championship peak and still carrying the baggage of a prison sentence and a globally televised disqualification. Warren's gamble on bringing him across the Atlantic paid off in exactly the currency that mattered most to everyone financing the event. Proof that Tyson's name alone could fill a venue, independent of who stood across the ring from him or how long the fight actually lasted. For Julius Francis, the fight delivered what it was always realistically going to deliver for his career, the biggest payday and the widest exposure of his professional life, purchased at the cost of 4 knockdowns against the most famous heavyweight in the world. He did not fight for a world title that night, and he was never in position to. Francis kept fighting at the domestic level for years afterward, but nothing on his record would ever again put his name in front of an audience this size. The boots joke, in hindsight, reads less like a gag and more like the clearest-eyed assessment anyone connected to the fight offered in public. For Tyson, Manchester was one stop on a calendar that already had its next entries fixed before this fight happened. He would go on to face Lau Severez and then Andrew Golota later that same year, part of a run of fights designed less to build toward a specific rival than to keep him active and marketable, while the far bigger question hovering over the division.
And Mike relying on that wild lunging right.
A unification fight against the undisputed champion, Lennox Lewis, remained unresolved. Manchester did not answer that larger question. What it did was remove any doubt about the narrower one, whether audiences outside the United States would still turn out for Tyson, and whether he could still deliver the kind of ending they came for when they did. It is worth resisting the temptation to read too much beyond that narrower answer, because the fight itself never claimed to offer more. A 2-round mismatch against a domestic champion, however dramatic the knockdowns looked on replay, tells a promoter and a broadcaster that a name can still sell tickets. It does not tell a division whether that name can still beat the best available opposition. And the gap between those two questions is exactly what made Manchester useful for Tyson's immediate business interests, while leaving the larger question about his standing among elite heavyweights completely untouched. That gap is also what makes this fight worth revisiting on its own terms, rather than treating it as a forgotten footnote between more significant results. Not every consequential night in a fighter's career has to answer a championship question. Some nights exist purely to answer a commercial one, and Manchester answered its question as decisively, in its own narrower category, as any 12-round unification fight ever settles a sporting one. Julius Francis walked into that ring already understanding which category this fight belonged to. The 4 knockdowns that followed only confirmed how right he had been about it before the opening bell ever rang.